everyone. Welcome to our SmartBear webinar, Ditch the Monolith, Scale Financial Services APIs. So happy to have you here today with us. To introduce myself and my co-host, my name is Ariel Harrington. I'm the Director of Product Marketing for our API Lifecycle Solutions, which includes SwaggerHub, Ready API, and Pactflow. I'm happy to be joined today by Alex Bonstrom. He's a solutions engineer with our API Lifecycle Solutions encompassing the same suite of products. Just a few quick housekeeping items before we get started with our content. Today's session will be recorded for on-demand viewing. We'll send out a link soon after this session with the recording, some notes, and some helpful resources and upcoming events. You'll be able to watch the webinar again at your leisure and share it with colleagues or your network who may have missed it. At any time during today's session, please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A box. We'll answer those toward the end of the session when we have our open Q&A. We're really excited to be presenting this content today, and we're happy to answer any and all of your questions that you'd like to ask during this session. So we've got a jam-packed agenda full of some really great content. I'll run through the growing popularity of microservices and some of the challenges when it comes to enforcing standards and governance within those microservices. I'll then turn it over to Alex to talk a little bit about how you can leverage SwaggerHub for standards and governance enforcement. Then I'll chat a little bit about contract testing before Alex gives you a second demo about how to use Pactflow to take SwaggerHub output to then use within your bidirectional contract testing workflows. Then we'll chat a little bit about how SwaggerHub and Pactflow can be used together to really maximize your financial services success as you look to migrate off of monoliths onto microservices in order to really maximize and scale your API suite. Lastly, I'll introduce our annual survey, the State of Software Quality Survey for API. This is a software that helps develop and track trends around API development, design, testing, and challenges that may exist in today's API solutions and workflows. And lastly, we'll get back together for that Q&A. So again, feel free to put your questions within the Q&A box anytime during the webinar, and we're happy to take a look at those and answer them towards the end of the session. Before we jump in, we'd love to take a quick poll. So you'll see that jump up on your screen, and feel free to click the option that's most relevant to you. So what we're asking is, how satisfied are you with your current API development processes and workflows? Of course, everyone is at a different point in their API journey. We're seeing a lot of popularity among the movement from monolithic to microservices architectures. We're seeing changes over time as APIs really gain popularity into the challenges that can exist, working in teams, collaborating, scaling, ensuring that changes are not breaking your existing APIs, and just a number of different challenges that are faced today with the immense growth of APIs. So we're happy to grab some insights from you and share those back out after the webinar pertaining to how satisfied you may be with your current development process and the workflows therein. Thanks so much for taking our poll. We really appreciate it. So let's jump in. Let's talk a little bit about digital transformation, the benefits, and then we'll talk a little bit about the challenges after that. So we've seen in a number of different B2B and B2C organizations, financial services being one, a highly regulated industry, an industry that is really moving toward focus on digital transformation and enhancing that customer experience. We've seen that modernization really accelerating over the past few years. So this overall digital transformation has really been made possible through the use of APIs. So you'll see on the far left side of your screen, think about that provider as a retail bank. It may have some legacy services. It has tremendous amounts of account data and history that are digitized that may not be exposed to other systems externally. So by flowing data to the right towards the consumer, let's think of that as a fintech startup, an app where a consumer or an end user can go to access mortgage comparison rates. I'm sure we're all seeing those mortgage rates go up by the day in the US. So it's really important that an end user can get into that app, see the current rates, and then be able to apply and lock in at the lowest rate possible. So that app is constantly looking to the provider to access that account data and to be able to then flow the data through to the far right box to that end user. They're applying for a mortgage. They're looking for a lot of those really important digital customer experience priorities. That would be a customized experience. That would be really quick responses. So the ability to enter their information and be able to understand what rates may apply to them. It's important to them that when they make a request, the response is quick and that's reliable. They want a secure transaction. They want to know that their data is safe. And then the consumer back to the provider, as they're leveraging that API where the provider is exposing that information, the consumer will then access, they'll get some sort of revenue from that subscription. There are agreements between these providers and consumers. They can be one to many, they can be many to many, depending on how the consumer has really built their app and how it evolves over time. So it's important to remember is that for each of these three parties, it's important for those APIs to maintain functionality over time, to be reliable, to be able to really operate the way that the API is saying that it will in the initial build. And we know through recent surveys, such as our survey, our app survey, which was recently released, that app development and release cycles are really accelerating. We're seeing those more frequently than once a week now. So as those apps are updated, how do we know that the API is abiding by current regulations? How do we know that the API will work? How do we know that the API will operate just as the provider and consumer have agreed that they have said it would, so that that end user can really have that optimal experience? So again, as we're seeing this API growth, it is very difficult to maintain those APIs and keep them operable within a monolithic architecture. Even minor changes can break the operation of the API, and they can break dependent APIs as well. So we're seeing that movement from monolithic architectures to microservices architectures. In last year's State of Software Quality Survey, 61% of our respondents chose microservices as the biggest driver for API growth. As you're able to make that movement to a microservices architecture, you're then really able to scale with ease. Your developers can develop and deploy and change APIs with an enhanced agility and with less worry that their changes may break APIs elsewhere in the cycle. You can see in the chart on the right that even the most conservative estimates show a 10-year API growth in the hundreds of millions and growing even further from there into the billions. So we're really experiencing a tremendous amount of API growth. You need, as you're developing these APIs, especially within a highly regulated industry, a single source of truth for how those APIs should look, how they should operate, and how teams should be able to collaborate on those together to ensure they will continue working over time, that going back to the previous slide, they will really end up driving that enhanced customer experience, and that you'll be able to scale over time as more and more market trends drive increased apps, increased mobile experiences, and other important customer experience touch points that can really ensure revenue growth, ensure customer stickiness, and other important priorities of that nature. So again, why is this change to microservices important? Of course, if you're looking at a current monolithic architecture and the change to microservices, it does represent a large change in the way that you may do things. But once you do get over that initial barrier to entry, you're able to really develop APIs in an increasingly scalable and agile way. So the first on the left, responding to market trends. As changes happen in the industry, as there are new priorities, new solutions, as customers are, purchasing in different ways and expect different experiences, you don't want to have to overhaul your entire architecture to be able to respond to that market trend. Working within a microservices architecture really ensures that responsiveness and the agility that's needed to keep up in today's business landscape. You can really scale with ease. APIs are becoming more and more preponderant, as you saw in the prior slide, with really that upward curve, even in the most conservative estimates for API growth year over year. As you're adding more and more APIs to your estate, you want to be able to scale, make changes, and move through those APIs, knowing that provider and consumer will both be assured that the API growth will be managed, the changes will be managed, and there won't be breaking changes in that development lifecycle, and change management will work smoothly. Lastly, of course, keeping your customers happy. Some of this is a B2B use case, but of course, at the end of the day, it's more of a B2B to C use case. You want your end customers to be happy. You want your end users to purchase more of your offerings. You want to be able to market to them in a customizable way. APIs are really making all of that happen. So the greater agility and responsiveness and control you have over that API estate, and the more that you can manage those changes, you can keep your customers happy over time and help to grow and scale your revenue in a new digital landscape. So now let's dive into standards and governance. So of course, in a highly regulated industry like financial services, there are a number of different regulatory bodies that will be controlling the way that information flows. Personal information, GDPR, open banking, other types of regulatory and security compliance are paramount in this landscape. There's a lot of security risk. There's a lot of just different ways that information can be exposed, and you want to be confident that within your API estate and with the way that you're exposing data to other parties, that you're following those compliances. We're seeing in other industries, such as the growth of FHIR and other types of data compliance. There are new types of regulations coming along fairly frequently. And what you need is a system that can help you really easily implement those within your workflows without causing painful manual processes, breaking other APIs, being able to just really manage those changes in a streamlined way. So standards and governance is really important here. Again, from API providers and consumers, you may have a one-to-one or a one-to-many relationship. A consumer may be grabbing data from multiple sources to consolidate it to then feed it through to that end user. You want to ensure that through your standardization, everything is talking to everything else in the way that you intend. Next is consistency. You want the data that you're sending to work consistently time after time. This is not a single transaction. Of course, you're looking, especially as your revenue may be based on that API as a product, to be enabling multiple transactions. And time after time, you want that reliability to ensure a good consumer experience, but also a great end user and customer experience. Standardization can also reduce latency. Just how long it takes data to move. We know that customers today are looking for that instant gratification, instant access to information. They don't want to wait. They won't sit with sort of a spinning wheel on their screen. So you want to ensure you're reducing that latency by making your APIs work as fluidly as possible. And of course, again, open banking and GDPR, you want to ensure that the systems you're building are compliant, and you want to ensure that they maintain that compliance as new regulations are introduced, as you have to make changes to your APIs over time. So let's talk about SwaggerHub. SwaggerHub is that single source of truth for API development. It's a collaborative and open API environment where designers and developers can come into a single location to create APIs and build that single source of truth. So SwaggerHub enables that faster standardized API design. It is that centralized place where multiple teams can come together, either multiple decentralized development teams. Of course, many of us are working globally. Those teams need to be able to participate in your standards and governance oversight within that single solution. So SwaggerHub can represent that. And also, of course, those teams are not working in a vacuum. You need the ability to also provide API documentation to consumers and execute on the rest of that API lifecycle. So there are some great integrations available through SwaggerHub. It can act as an IDE where all these test parties can come on board and set the stage for the rest of your product development. Some more specifics about how you can really dive in and enforce your API governance in SwaggerHub. Domains, also known as code libraries or shared libraries, can really represent that single source of truth. The APIs within SwaggerHub can consume these definitions directly. Custom rules, they can really easily consume provider style guides. We still see style guides in some cases in PDFs, which makes processes manual, prone to errors, and really doesn't provide any efficiency as developers are, really rapidly trying to develop and push APIs through the rest of the workflow. So being able to enforce those contract style guides and documentation rules within SwaggerHub adds some great efficiencies and reliability as you're designing and building those APIs. Something new that I'd like to highlight within SwaggerHub that just came out this summer are custom API templates. So users and admins within your organization can implement a standardized template to ensure that consistency through the design and development process. So they can store that standardized template. They can even build it off an existing template within SwaggerHub. And then as the developers, the designers, the architects are coming into SwaggerHub, they can see those custom API templates and use them repeatedly rather than having to start from scratch every time they're developing. This is allowing various standards that may slow down workflows to then be instantly implemented, and developers can start building right off of that instead of having to start from square one. Lastly, we have external automation partnerships. You want to ensure that when as your document is leaving SwaggerHub or your API is leaving SwaggerHub, it needs to be read not only by humans as it can be in the UI within SwaggerHub, but also by a machine. So we ensure that those are both machine and human readable, so that no matter how your software development lifecycle progresses beyond your API development, you're able to really flexibly work with that API. And now I'd love to turn it over to Alex to talk a little bit more about the workflow, and then how just show a demo of how SwaggerHub can work within these standards and governance guidelines that I've just laid out.
Awesome. Thanks, Ariel. Hey there, everybody. Great to meet with you all today. I'm Alex. I'm a solutions engineer here, like I mentioned previously. So I'll be doing the SwaggerHub demo and also kind of talking about what an ideal API development flow looks like. So we have a high level image here. Could we go to the next slide, get a little more context? So of course, when it comes to APIs, when we're talking about like design first, mapping out the functionality of our API, we're going to start in the API design phase. So in that big green box. And this is actually where we will be working directly in SwaggerHub. So of course, SwaggerHub has everything you need to design your API. So like Ariel mentioned, it's got an IDE of its own. We do also have some great IDE plugins if anybody's interested in those. But this is where we start mapping out the functionality, right? You know, myself as a designer, I would go in, create what I think the API should look like. I can bring in my colleagues, have them review it. We can get some feedback. They can tell me it looks terrible. I can go and fix it. We'll iterate over and over and over. I'll get feedback. You know, I'll make use of SwaggerHub standardization. And then from there, right, what we end up with in that big green checkbox is a great document. Right? We know exactly how we want to build our API. We know exactly what it needs to do, and everybody involved is happy with it. Could we get another click, please? So, I kind of covered this already, but yeah, you know, we'll have the API designers, external collaborators, all providing feedback, and eventually, like I said, we'll end up with a great document. From there, right, we will start development, and this is where Pactflow comes into the picture, right? With Pactflow, what the real purpose is contract testing, and these contract tests are running very quickly. So the goal of it is, as developers are committing code, you can get instant validations as to if whether or not their new code, whether it's the consumer or the provider side, is in line with the other services that it's talking to. Right. So this is we kind of tie Pactflow directly into the development cycle, you know, kind of before integration testing. But here, you know, we can make sure that our developers are in line with not only our open API specification, but any other consumers or providers it is talking to. One more, please. Yep. At the same time, because we have defined what our API will do ahead of time, we can hand that document off to other teams to begin working in parallel with our developers, right? So based off of our open API file, we can hand this off to our testing team. They can take our open API definition, start building out test cases. So this could be done in a tool like Ready API. We're not talking about that today, but of course, if you're interested in functional performance testing, reach out to us. But yeah, so the great thing about doing design first, you know, and having your open API document on hand is the parallelization of your team's efforts. And lastly, right, what we'll have is, well, one, we'll have our API documentation, of course, right? We've defined that all the way back when we were using SwaggerHub, so we have really great documentation. We have an API that functions the way that all of our teams intended because it was built off that open API document. We have our tests, you know, created ahead of time because we know what the API is going to do. And now our consumers can you know, begin working with our provider and start, you know, making sure that they're abiding by what the provider is providing. Right, and this is done through bidirectional contract testing, specifically the Can I Deploy tool, which is a way to basically verify that your consumer is matching, you know, your open API document. That what the consumer expects is a subset of what the provider can offer. But yeah, I think from here we are ready to jump into a little demo of SwaggerHub. All right. So, of course, SwaggerHub is our API documentation tool. You know, there's a lot of functionality we can go through today, but we're here to focus on, you know, how you can standardize your documentation today. So the first thing that we have is domains. So a domain, again, is a document within SwaggerHub. It's going to act as a shared component library. That way, when you have your standardized components, you put them all into a singular file. So I've actually created a domain for today based off of the BIAN standardized components, right? BIAN, the open banking framework, they have standardized components that they want people to use for API communication. I took one of their documents. Actually, I can show you that as well in a moment. But I pulled a lot of these standardized components and I put them into a domain file here. So now when I'm building my APIs and I want them to be BIAN compliant, I can pull the components directly from this file. And I only need one of these files, right? That's one of the big advantages of domains within SwaggerHub. We only need to instantiate these components once in a singular domain for reuse. So this is actually an open API file provided on the official BIAN GitHub page. I pulled it out of GitHub, put it into SwaggerHub. You can see I have a lot of standardization errors. Ignore those for now. But here you can see I have a lot of components listed here, in this document, and where these are defined are actually in the document, right, all the way down here at the bottom, right? So this is kind of inefficient when you're working with SwaggerHub. So with domains, what we can do is I actually have all of these components in my domain file as well here. So let's see, I have a bad request error, right? I believe I have that guy here in this document. Yep, I do. Right here. So I'm actually going to pull out that local declaration because, it's instantiated on the file, which is, defeating the point of domains. And I'm going to start referencing this one. And to do that, all I actually have to do is just start typing the name of the object. You can see that Swagger editor code complete is helping me out a lot. Right there, I am given a couple options that I can import directly. One of them is local. That is the one in this file. We don't want that one because, right, we want to make use of domains. And we can see that this one is actually on the domain file that I created previously. So I'll set my reference here. And there we go. So now if I go through and remove all of my old bad request error references, I can remove that object from this file completely, make it a little bit cleaner, and then we're leaning heavily on our domains. But so will every other API document in my environment. That's the point of them, right? A single source for your reusable components. So domains are great for 3 reasons. One, saves time for your developers, right? The code complete is going to hold your hand. So if you trust whoever is managing your domains that they are being instantiated and maintained properly, referencing them is trivial. Also, reduce the amount of code clutter you have. There are a lot of standardized buy-in components, like a lot. I was looking through it yesterday. So imagine instantiating all of these components on every document you want to access them in. That's a lot of extra YAML. I've been selling SwaggerHub for a little over 1.5 years now. YAML's not that fun to look at, trust me. So consolidate these components into a domain file. And lastly, of course, it's the whole interoperability, standardized, security compliant, all that stuff that you get with domains, right? If you're managing your domains well and you have this great set of standardized components and your developers are referencing those, that you're kind of being pretty compliant across the board. Besides that, we also mentioned that we have custom rules within SwaggerHub. So domains is one step of standardization within SwaggerHub. We also have custom rules. Now, custom rules are a way to enforce your API guidelines on your documentation, right? So lots of organizations will have their own API guidelines, a way to keep their APIs in sync with each other, make sure they're up to our industry standards, make sure that you're matching any compliance needs based off of your industry. So we have a way to programmatically enforce those within SwaggerHub. I want to be really explicit. If anybody hasn't looked at a Swagger tool before, the Swagger editor does do open API validation. This is not that. This is one step higher. This is more robust standardization. So I do have an example of an error here. Responses must contain at least 1 2xx code definition. Right? This isn't a necessary thing for an API. We don't have to define successful response codes. But for me and my team using SwaggerHub, this is something that is important to us, which is why we're using SwaggerHub standardization. So these rules will run against your documents. It's safe to assume if a document is at rest within SwaggerHub, your rules have run against it, and any errors are actually persisted in our database. But let's take a quick look at how these rules work. So they're maintained on a per org level. So when you have your SwaggerHub org, you'll want to go into your org settings down to your standardization. We do have some pre-built rules, but these are pretty basic, high level, pretty popular to use. But this is what we really want to focus on, is the custom rules. Now, apologies, I don't have anything built out specifically for open banking or fintech, but I did a while ago come across a rule specifically for FHIR. So FHIR is a set of industry standards around healthcare interoperability, right? There is a rule where you need to make sure that, what's being returned is only in the format of application/FHIR plus JSON. So I have a rule that every time one of my responses produces information, it must be returned in application/fire plus JSON, right? This MIME format. So this way, anytime my developers are working on documents within my org and they don't have this MIME type as what is produced from the API, they're going to receive an error, right? They're going to know, oh, I'm actually not compliant with FHIR right now based off of my guidelines. I need to go back and fix this. So we can hold our developers accountable. We can standardize our documentation at design time, which becomes incredibly powerful. So with this tool, of course, this is available for use. You can codify your own guidelines. So if you have organizational guidelines you want to enforce buy-in, open banking API guidelines, these are all things that you can codify, put into SwaggerHub, and enforce on your documentation programmatically. And the last piece that I want to talk about are your custom templates. So this is something that, as Ariel was saying, we added very recently to SwaggerHub. We now have the ability to create templates that you can kind of build other documents off of, right? So you know, a lot of organizations nowadays are moving towards having their APIs designed by non-developers, you know, people who may not be comfortable with YAML, right? Technical writers, product owners, analysts. So templates are a way to kind of make that process a little bit more plug and play, right? You can map out how you want your APIs to look. Maybe you know, give some nice descriptions like, you know, insert this here, you know, to really direct your developers. And that way, when they go and create new documents, like I'm about to, right? That document we were just looking at was called a basic template. Right now, if I want a developer to build off of that, I can create a new API. Make sure you pick the org that your template is in. Oh, and it's actually already selected for me. So you know, I'm gonna have this fake document, and now every time I build a document off this template, I'm gonna have this great jumping off point that I can get started with development. So you know, if you're making use of this feature, you can really hold your developers' hands in a lot of ways, and that's what this is about, right? You know, we buy tools to make our lives easier. So with domains, you know, developers don't have to worry about instantiating their own components and making sure they're interoperable with other services. With standardization rules, you're really saying, hey, you are not following what we agreed upon in our API guidelines. And with custom templates, you're really giving your developers and designers a fantastic jumping off point to get started creating APIs. Ariel, I think I'll hand things back to you to continue on before we talk about Pactflow.
Thanks so much, Alex. Let me pull my screen back up. All right. So now we've looked at, you know, the beginning of that API workflow that Alex laid out around API design and documentation in SwaggerHub. Now we'd love to dive into the next part of our presentation around contract testing and Pactflow. So let's start with the basics. What is contract testing? So API providers and consumers generally have an agreement of the way an API should behave. And they expect that behavior and that agreement to continue over time. So what contract testing can do is really calm the chaos that happens within those growing microservices. If you have one contract at every integration point, those can grow really quickly, and it can affect developers' ability to really deploy with confidence. And as you get into production, as you code commit and roll those APIs into production, fixing errors becomes more and more costly. There are studies about the costs over time, and just the earlier you're catching these bugs in your process, the cheaper it will be, the faster you can work, and the more confidence you can have at the point of deployment. So the goals of contract testing are to remove the over-reliance on other types of testing, complex test environments, and just the slowness that can happen when you are testing in deployment. So you can test with contract testing. Each of these purple boxes on the screen represents an integration point. You can test a single integration at a time with contract testing. You can get fast, reliable feedback. The tests are scalable linearly. And also, importantly, you can deploy these services with confidence and deploy them independently. So let's talk about a little bit more about why contract testing. So there are a number of traditional testing techniques. As you're scaling, as your API state is growing, you want those testing techniques to be able to scale and grow with you. If you don't understand how your consumers are using your API, it can really slow down the process of making changes and ensuring that those changes are not breaking the consumer's use of the API. Contract testing can really help out here. You have more visibility into that consumer use, which reduces the need for version after version, and you can prevent those breaking changes. And by reducing the reliance on any one specific type of testing, you can have more confidence in the safety to release, in the simplicity of the testing, and in just the overall confidence that when you commit and get to production, the APIs will continue to work as agreed upon in that initial contract between provider and consumer. If you think back to our initial slide about how existing banks and financial services organizations are really looking to maintain the strength of that interconnectivity, the importance of standards and governance, the security, different aspects of how that API needs to look, needs to work, and needs to also operate with other services. You want to ensure that you have confidence that as those changes happen, as you're looking to add and remove APIs to keep up with market trends and keep up with various needs of the end user, that API is working always as the provider and the consumer agreed that it would. So now we're looking at Pactflow specifically. SmartBear is really excited to have Pactflow join our API lifecycle family back in June. Pactflow is a bidirectional complete contract testing platform. So some of those challenges that we laid out are solved by Pactflow. Visibility into API usage and the preventing of that breaking changes. You want to understand the way that your API changes or the way that your API operation may change over time, and if it will have any impact on the way that any of your consumers are using the API today. Once you get into production, that cost only increases and multiplies. You don't want those broken changes to make it into code commit or into production. So let's pull that testing way back into the design and development phase and be sure that we can do it quickly. Pactflow is also multi-workflow and multi-protocol. So we continue expanding the ways in which Pactflow can seamlessly integrate into your existing workflows and enhance those workflows and also work across protocols and across specifications. You're able to easily scale. Teams are growing. Teams are working in different time zones, different environments. Each team needs to be able to work independently, but also collaborate and ensure that the work that they're doing is the agreed upon business need and the business agreement between provider and consumer of that API. So that is all enabled by our Pactflow solution. So let's talk a little bit more about bidirectional contract testing. Bidirectional contract testing is working extremely well with the SwaggerHub documentation that you saw earlier. By using a schema-based contract testing approach, it's supporting your open API workflows, and it's very easy to retrofit it into your existing systems. So as you're building out your microservices, as you're adding services and APIs over time, you can really easily integrate Pactflow into those services to ensure that everything is working as you agreed it should. It also integrates with many common tools and frameworks that you see in the chart at the right. so that you can work within environments and workflows that you're familiar with today with the enhancement of contract testing. It helps to balance out your testing pyramid to ensure that there's no over-reliance on any specific type of testing that you may be using today. It enables that shift left motion. It enables confidence in deployment. And it overall ensures that your collaboration inside and outside of your business is working as it should. Now I'll turn it back over to Alex to show you a little bit more about how the Pactflow tool works in production.
Awesome. Thanks, Ariel. So we're going to keep this part of the presentation very high level because it is very easy to get in the weeds when talking about Pactflow and Pact contract testing generally. But the cool thing that I really like about this product is it kind of fits perfectly into our story of API development. With SwaggerHub, we have defined our API, what it should do. We've all agreed upon it. That's fantastic, right? This is the dream state of our API, and hopefully our consumers abide by our open API document. But then the question always comes up, well, how do we ensure that people are actually doing what the API document says they should do, right? Well, that's something that we recently solved with the acquisition of Pactflow and specifically bidirectional contract testing. So now, when you're doing bidirectional contract testing and you have that open API document or API specification file, you can now say, hey, consumers, you have to make sure that your requests are a valid subset of this contract, right? So your consumers will define their expectations in the form of a consumer contract or a packed file. And that'll be compared to the actual open API file. So here we actually have one of our verification results. And sorry, the other side of the house as well, right? How do we ensure that there's no provider drift? Provider drift being, here's our open API document. We need to ensure that our actual provider matches what this guy says it should do. Right. So again, that's bidirectional contract testing. We're kind of starting with the truth in the middle, like an open API document, and validating both sides of the interaction from there. So I have a verification result here. Verification results are just it's an understanding as to whether or not our consumers and providers are in line with each other or the open API document when we talk about bidirectional. So I have a set of verification result here. There's a lot of information here. We can ignore that for now. What we're interested in is the contract comparisons. So like I mentioned, you're still making a consumer contract. For those of you unfamiliar with Pactflow, generally, I do have a quick diagram that I can show to help out. With the consumer contract, we defined the requirements from the perspective of the consumer in the format of unit tests. Hey, when I send this, I expect this back, right? That's an expectation. That gets stored in the form of a contract, a packed file, also in bidirectional called the consumer contract. So we define the expectations from the consumer in the consumer contract. We can see those here. Right. The first interaction is MB get products 200. Here's the request that we are sending, and here's the expected response. So in bidirectional, which we see right here, we're doing a cross-contract validation. So we are comparing our consumer contract against our provider contract, and we basically make sure that the consumer contract is a valid subset of the provider contract. Is the consumer in line with the API that we defined in that contract? So we see the results here. It's not super descriptive, but it does tell us whether or not these two contracts are valid with each other. So we know, at least from the consumer point of view, for this interaction or this integration, that it is valid, right? The consumer is matching what the open API document says. The other side, of course, is the provider contract. So in bidirectional, the first result that we just looked at, right, contract comparison valid, that's right here. We also need to validate that our provider is in line with our open API document now. So the way this happens is it is BYO provider testing tool. So some great options are Dread, Postman, Ready API. There's a lot of great tools that you can use for this, basically just like a Swagger compliance check. And what'll happen is will actually, one, will render your open API document super useful, right? Now, if somebody wants to come see the state of this integration, they not only have the consumer contract, so what we expect from a consumer point of view, but also what the provider is expected to provide. And then we also have the self-verification test result. So whatever provider testing framework you are using, you can store the results here with a little bit of kind of logging messaging here. So you have what's the information that is important to you. So that's kind of what bidirectional contract testing looks like, right? We are doing two verifications here. We're doing contract versus contract, consumer and provider, as well as provider verification to make sure that our provider is in line with our open API document. So this is really cool, especially when we're talking about the standardization story, because like we were talking about on that workflow diagram, right? The whole story, design, development, test, release, all that stuff. The truth is the open API document, right? This guy is standardized. This guy says exactly what our API should do. Everybody is in agreement with how this API dictates our API will behave. Our API document dictates how our API will behave. So when we throw Pactflow into the mix, we don't only have a great document anymore, we also know that our consumers and our providers are in line with what we have defined and what we have already standardized. So it's almost as though the provider development and consumer development are standardized kind of down the line because of us using the standardization features in SwaggerHub. So this is a very cool story that we now have, because Pactflow is now a part of the SmartBear story. All right, Ariel, I think we have a couple more slides to get through. Yeah. So why SwaggerHub and Pactflow for the financial services success? So as I was kind of just mentioning, when you use these tools in tandem, you're not only standardizing kind of your API development workflow, but you're standardizing the process. So you'll define what your API will do. You'll make sure it's compliant with your industry as well as any organization regulations. And then you can make sure that the development that happens around that API from the consumer and provider standpoint match and are abiding by what you've defined. So SwaggerHub, used to unify teams around a central source of truth. This is something we preach all the time, right? If you got a large organization, even a small organization, if you have multiple microservices, documentation is really important. Hey, I need to talk to your microservice from my microservice. Where's the documentation? Oh, it's in a branch in GitHub somewhere. Well, now I got to go hunt it down. So we absolutely preach that a central source of truth is imperative for a matured API development process. Having a repeatable process for API development, really important to speed things up, right? If every single time we want to make changes to our code, that process and workflow looks different, that's not safe development, right? That's going to get messy. It's going to get confusing. So having a repeatable process, really important. Pactflow increases the visibility of how your consumers are using your APIs, right? This is really important for API providers. We are making APIs to be consumed. Nobody's making an API to just sit there and not be used. So when we have an understanding of what the expectations are from our consumer in hard-coded request and response interactions, that is incredibly valuable for provider teams. And all of this, right, when we're doing design first and we're defining our APIs ahead of time, our development teams can work independently, right? We want to work asynchronously. I don't want to have to wait for another team to finish what they're doing before I can get started with what I want to do. That makes no sense anymore, right? It's 2022. Automation is a thing. We with these tools, right, you can make sure that teams work asynchronously and that people are getting work done quickly. Prevent breaking changes. We probably touched upon it a little bit, but it's important to note that Pactflow kind of happens at the code check-in point, right? Developer makes some code that they're happy with, they check it in. That's when we want to run the contract tests, right? We don't want to run our integration tests and our end-to-end tests, which may be hours long, speaking from experience. We don't want to run those tests until we know that our services are still in line with the other services. So any breaking changes will get instant validation rather than have to wait, a long time for it. And there's also the reduced need for API versioning, right? When teams can work asynchronously and deploy asynchronously, this makes it a lot easier. I met with a team yesterday. We were looking at Pactflow. Their use case was perfect. They were part of an acquisition. Their team's deployment cadence was very different from the deployment team in the other organization. So there was a lot of mismatches, a lot of problems with Pactflow. They would have the ability to get a better understanding as to whether or not the code changes that they're making and the code changes that the other team is making, still work with each other, much faster. And when there are breaking changes, they get instant feedback. They don't have to wait for their tests to finish. Next slide, please. Yep. So, we're here again talking about how these two products work really well together. I do want to mention we are working on an integration between the two. I think, as most of you saw on the call today, there's a really great story to tell when you use these products in tandem, and that's something that we want to simplify for you guys as well. So you can expect that early 2023 in integration between these two products. But again, with SwaggerHub here, we bring in all of our team members to work together on our API documentation. We have all the tools needed to develop APIs. Once you've gotten started development, start standardizing. Make sure that you're abiding by your organization, your teams, and your industry's API standards for what you're developing. And then from there, right, you end up with fantastic documentation, right? But again, that's not the whole story. Now we need to talk about development, where Pactflow comes into play. Pactflow helps you take this existing fantastic API documentation and help you secure the development that happens around this open API specification, right? Your consumers will need to match what the API document says the API will do, and your providers actually need to provide what the open API document says the API will provide, right? So this way, all of your team members have full visibility into what's going on, both how the APIs should behave as well as how consumers and providers are interacting with the open API specification, and all of your teams can work independently and deploy safely. So yeah, this is a very cool story between these two products. And yeah, Ariel, I'll hand it back to you to wrap things up.
Thanks so much, Alex. Really appreciate it. So I know you guys are attending this webinar to hear from us, but actually we are asking for your help today. As many of you may know, we have an annual State of Software Quality Survey. We're looking to survey anyone involved in the API development lifecycle to help us really paint a picture of how development, testing, and quality are changing over the years and how they're looking in 2022. This year, for each respondent, we're partnering with 3 awesome charities. You'll see those on the right: Make-A-Wish, AnitaB.org, and ClearLoop. So this survey really just takes about, let's say, 10-15 minutes. Once you're completed with that survey, you get to choose a charity that will direct a donation to on your behalf. So we're really excited to be partnering with these charities and to be able to make an impact as we're also bringing surveying and thought leadership back to the industry. So if you complete that survey, you'll receive a copy of our report along with various charts and graphs of the data analysis that we performed from our survey respondents. We've put the link to the survey in the chat window. Please feel free to click on that. Feel free to share it with any colleagues or any of your networks who may be interested in helping us understand and analyze the state of the API development industry today and trends for the future. We really appreciate your participation in that survey. And if you missed the link on this call, we'll also send it out after in our webinar wrap-up email. So thank you so much for attending today. We'll take a look at some of the Q&A that I see coming through in the Q&A box. And please feel free to put any other questions you may have, and we'll get to those in the last 4 minutes we have here.
So we got one question here. How does Pactflow work with partner developer organizations? Would they use the provider licenses, or would they need to more likely set up their own Pactflow ecosystems? So this is an interesting use case, mainly because it's really helpful to have access to the code base when you're doing these verifications. So we see that the classic Pactflow use case is organizations with lots of microservices, and every team is responsible for their own microservices, right? They work asynchronously from each other. So consumers and providers all within the same organization. For a system like this, it might be beneficial to do this, but what you would end up doing is when you have your pact file or you're doing your provider verification, you would have to run it against the actual provider, right? Because if you're not part of that partner organization, you wouldn't have access to that provider code base. So what it would look like is it may end up being like an integration test almost, right? With Pactflow, when you're doing internal verifications, it's very common to stub out the dependencies of your provider. So that way, right, if we're making an API call to a provider, we don't want to I'm getting really technical here. I'm just now realizing. I'm sorry, folks, but it would be possible to validate against the provider, and they wouldn't need a license, because that would be your pact file or your open API file that you're validating against their provider, and you can just point to that API URL. Any other questions? I do see the one about the single product license offering. I am on the more on the technical side, so I don't know about pricing and licensing. I do know, there will be initiative to kind of bundle the two, but I don't know anything about pricing or licensing. Ariel, I don't know if you have more on that.
I can shed a little light there. So we will be offering in Q4, as we're building to that integration, bundle offering to help both new SwaggerHub and Pactflow users and existing SwaggerHub customers who are looking to try out contract testing, a discounted way to purchase SwaggerHub and Pactflow together. So those bundles will be available starting next week. We'll be sending along more details, but as the two offerings become integrated, we'll still be able to package them either separately or together, really depending on the needs of your organization and how it will work best in your workflows. So if anyone is interested in learning a little bit more about that, we're happy to chat about it. Feel free to reach out to us to respond to any of the emails we've sent, and an account rep is happy to chat with you to share some of those details and help you form the best package that works for your organization.
Oh, I think we're up on the hour. So I think we should wrap things up. Well, thank you everybody for attending. Hope you learned something, got a little bit of insight as to how SwaggerHub and Pactflow can help you standardize your API development process and help you with contract testing and make sure all development teams are in line. Yeah, Ariel, any final words?
That's all. Thanks so much all for spending some time with us today. We look forward to seeing you at future events. Thank you.
Yep.